Break. I'm pleased to welcome our next speaker this afternoon, Dr. Göz Kaufmann. Göz is an adjunct professor of German linguistics at the Albert Ludwig University of Freiburg in Germany, which, for those of you that don't know, it is the sister city of Madison, Wisconsin. Freiburg and Madison are Partnerstädte. Dr. Kaufmann's research interests cover topics related to language variation, language change, and sociolinguistics, with a focus on German minority varieties in language context situations, and language and group attitudes. In recent years, he has worked with speakers of Pomeranian in Brazil, and actually to a certain extent in Wisconsin, and speakers of Plattdeutsch, Mennonite Low German, in Mexico and the United States. And the topic of his presentation this afternoon is Russian Mennonites in North America. 3 countries, 3 identities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kaufmann.
Yeah, hello. First of all, I would like to thank the Max Kade Institute for inviting me, and I'm really very pleased, just like Peter, to be back in Madison. Yeah, and I'm going to talk about Russian Mennonites in North America, 3 countries, 3 identities, and there's nothing better to get to know a person than talking about suitcases. And this is So this is very weak, this mic. So now we are going to look at one of the stimulus sentences I used in a research project. He can't listen to you because he's unpacking his luggage. Although suitcase does not appear, many informants translated it with suitcase. And the research project, I called it Verbal Syntax of German Varieties in the Americas. And I have people translate 46 or 61 stimulus sentences from English, Spanish, or Portuguese into their local dialect. And so far, I've done that with 709 speakers. The last interview took place 2 days ago in Fond du Lac with the Pomeranian woman, 19 years old, but mentally very fit. And I've done that from 1999 till 2002. I have asked 321 Mennonites in 5 countries to translate these sentences. And you can access these, all the interviews, and I strongly recommend that, in the archive for spoken German at the IDS. So they are all publicly available. In 2002, I had 24 speakers of Hunsrückisch from Brazil do the same thing. And since 2017, I have done it with 364 Pomeranians, mostly from Brazil, 12 from Wisconsin. I hope to get another 3 to 4 in the coming days. And this is, although this is Pomeranian now, and they have to translate 61 sentences because they are even more interestingly than Mennonite Low German. But the interesting thing is that this fits very well with our topic of my talk. 90% of the Pomeranians migrated to the United States, mostly to Wisconsin. Only 5% migrated to Brazil. My youngest informant is 78 years old here. In Brazil, you have still 250,000 speakers of Pomeranian and many 15-year-olds among them. So it seems, with the exception of Pennsylvania German, it seems that the US-American soil is not a good place for heritage languages. So we are going to talk about this, and I'm going to show you 3 translations from 3 informants from Seminole, Texas. And as a linguist, I would like to talk about a lot of things, but you won't let me. So we are going to just talk about the fact how they translated, well, if they translated the container from which they unpacked the stuff, how that sounds.
He can't listen to you because he's unpacking his luggage.
Hij kan niet die hargen wil hij dat zijn tas uitpakken.
Hij kan niet hargen die wijn hij dat zijn chemadon uitpakken.
Hij kan niet die hargen wijn hij dat zijn suitcase uitpakken.
So as a linguist, I have to draw your attention to the fact that before the word tas, chemadon, suitcase comes up, in 2 cases, we have a slight hesitation. So the we will call a filled pause. So it seems that the person is looking for the word tash, but has some problems to find it. Perhaps suitcase comes quicker to mind. And in the last one, you have an actual pause, which probably has nothing to do with the tune form, but with the suitcase, which follows. Yeah? So that is very interesting. 50 of my informants in Seminole described the container. So 10 of them used the German word Tosch, Tasche. That would be very close to standard German. That's just 20% of 50 people. 22 people used chevedon, whatever that is. And 15 people used suitcase. Very interesting. Now, obviously, we know, some of us know what chevedon is. Chevedon is the Russian word for koffer, and koffer would be the German translation for suitcase. So it's very interesting to think about that. These people, Peter talked about them. They came to Canada in the 1870s. So when I visited this data, they had lived like 130 years in North America. So I'm not sure whether they still knew that chevedon is a Russian loanword. Probably you don't know that they is a Scandinavian word in English, or skipper or skirt. So that is very interesting whether this means they identify with their Russian heritage, or it's just the normal word to use. Yeah? So let's go to Mexico, to Ciudad Cuauhtémoc. I'll give you 4 translations, and we are looking at the same thing, and we are listening to it.
No te puede escuchar porque está sacando las cosas de la maleta.
Hij kon die niet horen, hij neemt de zaken uit de tas uit.
Hij kon die niet horen, want hij de dingen uit de chemadon uitneemt.
Hij kon die niet horen, want hij neemt de dingen uit de maleta uit.
He can't listen to you because he's unpacking his luggage.
Hij kon niet naar die horen, want dat zijn suitcase uitpakken.
So you see, we have hesitations again, a prolongation of the pronunciation of seen in the last example, and a very long pause before maleta in the penultimate. But the most interesting thing is, you notice that the last person from Mexico translated from English. And 19 of my 184 informants from Mexico and Paraguay prefer to translate English stimulus sentences instead of Spanish stimulus sentences, which is a very weird, well, on first sight, it's very weird, because they have spent most of their life in Paraguay or Mexico. But most of them, as they came from Canada, still have a Canadian passport. And very frequently, they spend a year in Canada, and they come back from Canada to Paraguay or Mexico and speak English probably much better than I do. But they have lived their whole life in Paraguay and Mexico and hardly speak Spanish, or don't speak it very well. Not a single informant in Texas translated Spanish stimulus sentences, although they arrived in Texas from Mexico just 25 years before I elicited this data. So you see huge differences, and that's what we are going to talk about. So in Mexico, 51% of the informants used Tosh or Tosh, so half of them, many more than in the United States. 29 used chemadon. This number is slightly higher in the United States. 6 used maleta, a Spanish word, in comparison to 30% of the informants who used suitcase, the English word, the language of the majority language. Remember, in Mexico, they have arrived in 1922. In the United States, coming from Mexico, they arrived in 1976. That is a huge difference. One person in Mexico used suitcase, not a single person in the United States used maleta. Yeah, and they came from Mexico. So we could ask ourselves, what's wrong with Mexico? And obviously, this is a stupid question. I'm going to solve it later on. Nothing is wrong with Mexico. And I'm going to use data. Mark Loudon was the co-orienter of my PhD thesis. And I'm going to use data now, which I did not use in the publication of my PhD thesis, from sociolinguistic interviews. So I had interviews, and sorry for the spelling, it's my spelling, because many Mennonites are almost illiterate, so I had to fill the questionnaire in. And one of my questions was, and this is now a person who lives in the United States, 55 years old. That means she spent most of her life in Mexico. And the one of the questions is, what do you think about the United States? And she said, what's positive is it's a free country. What is negative? Nothing. And what do you think about Mexico? What is positive? Nothing. What is negative? They steal a lot. No law. Huh? So judging from a person who spent so much time in Mexico and probably had very little interaction with Mexicans, we could also ask, what's wrong with the Mennonites in Mexico? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to first talk a little bit. Peter has done a wonderful job, so I can shorten that a little bit. A history of Mennonite migrations. Then I'm going to talk about the Mennonites in Chihuahua and Texas. And I'm going to talk about attitude and language behavior and their relationship to self-identification. And then very short conclusion. So the history. We have already heard that the Anabaptist faith started in Switzerland mainly, and then it trickled up north to Flanders and Frisia and parts of northwestern Germany. And then they were being mistreated, they were being killed because neither the Catholic Church nor the developing Protestant churches were very fond of them. So many of them migrated in the 16th century to the West Prussian area, which at that time belonged to the Polish kingdom. So, and now the important thing is, why did they move? They moved later on from West Prussia to the Ukraine because one of the great problems was, and we will come back to this later on, the question of land. So the Prussian kingdom introduced a law saying you can only buy land if you have done your military service. Now, being pacifists, that was sort of a tough thing to tackle for Mennonites. And that was the reason not all Mennonites left, but why many Mennonites left, accepting the invitation of Catherine the Great. So they founded first the old colony in Chortica and then the new colony in Molochna. So in Russia, everything was fine more or less for 100 years. And then Russia commenced to change their politics towards Mennonites. And they also wanted Mennonites to serve in the army. And although in the end they found a compromise, so the Mennonites did not have to join the army, but they could work in the forestry. So young male Mennonites had to work in the forestry. Many Mennonites wouldn't accept this compromise, and they left in 1873 to Canada. And now the second, mostly from Chortica, this first wave is from Chortica. And now a very important, but also very simplified thing. So it was the more conservative Mennonites who left for Canada. And the more progressive Mennonites stayed in Russia. Now, a very important thing is, imagine the conservative people leave the country. So there's a certain chance that they will turn more and more conservative. Sorry, more and more conservative, because so to say the progressive counterpart. Why didn't you bring me water? No, just kidding. Counterpart is not there anymore. So the people who stayed in Russia turned a little bit more progressive because the conservative counterpart had left. So they stayed in Russia. In Canada, everything was fine till after World War I. Germany, there's a certain tendency for Germans to cause world wars in the 20th century. So Canada, as many other countries, were not very fond of Germany. So the Canadian government wanted the Mennonites to introduce English in their school system. The Mennonites didn't like that. So the more conservative Mennonites left for either Mexico or Paraguay. So now you have the conservative of the conservatives. Thank you very much. You are a real friend. They then there, and the consequence of this was obviously that the Canadian Mennonites who stayed turned out to be a little bit more progressive. Very simplified. But It's really, it's not wrong. So till that point, the conflict was always external to the Mennonite colonies. Now we have a lot of internal conflicts among the Mennonites. For example, in Paraguay, and we will see that that's the influence of the Molochna people who almost at the same time came to Paraguay from the Soviet Union. They started changing things, making things a little bit more modern. Many Mennonites in Paraguay didn't like that, so they migrated to Bolivia. And now you have the conservative of the conservative of the conservative people. And you go to Bolivia, Santa Cruz de la Sierra, you will notice that. It's the most conservative community you can find. In Mexico, the same thing happened. Rubber tires was the big problem, because with the rubber tires, you could go to the Mexican city and have contact with the majority society. So many Mennonites left for Belize and Bolivia. Conservative of the conservative of the conservative. And this caused a little bit more progressiveness in Mexico. In 1976, some Mennonites from Chihuahua left for West Texas, Seminole. Now, very importantly, it was not internal conflicts, it was shortage of land. The Mennonites used to have many, many children. That has changed in the last couple of decades. But there was not enough land in Chihuahua, so they went to West Texas. Very important. No internal conflicts, which makes the comparison even more interesting. So, shortly, the second point in 1930, reasons: Stalin, 5 years plans, the Holodomor. Many Mennonites tried, and some succeeded in leaving the Soviet Union, going to Canada, Brazil, and Paraguay. Mostly they came from the Molochna colonies and its daughter colonies. So now we have to, from the Soviet Union to the Americas, and they went a part to Canada, a part to Paraguay, a part to Brazil. Interestingly, remember, the Russian Mennonites were progressive, and they turned more and more progressive. They were very successful economically. They improved their school system. They introduced real High German, not just a hagiolect, which we would use in church and nobody would understand it. They could converse in a standard or a High German. So in Canada and Paraguay, interestingly, the Mennonites from both migration waves lived very close to each other. And for example, in Menno, which is actually a Kortitsa colony, today they speak much more Molochna than Kortitsa, because it's a more prestigious variety. So you have these constellations. And very interestingly, of my Paraguayan, Bolivian, and Brazilian informants, not a single one used the word Chemedon. And they had just left, or they left the Soviet Union in 1930, much later. Not a single one. Maybe they were traumatized and tried to avoid using anything which is connected with Russian, but they use other Russian loanwords like lovtia for shop. But nevertheless, it's very interesting. Words have their own history. Okay, the Mennonites in Chihuahua and Texas. And this part is now based on my PhD project. I sociolinguistically interviewed 139 Mennonites in Chihuahua and in Seminole, Texas. That's the wonderful book. I highly recommend it. And the subtitle of the book is Attitudes and Language Behavior of Russian German Mennonites in Mexico and the United States of America. Okay, this is the Ciudad de Mexico. This is Texas. This is Austin. This is Ciudad Juarez facing El Paso. So Ciudad Cuauhtemoc is here, and Seminole is Gaines County bordering New Mexico in West Texas. And remember, the interesting thing now is that these people who went to Seminole, they came from Ciudad Cuauhtemoc, and it was less an internal conflict. It was more an economic problem, shortage of land. Okay, it's very interesting. You have already noticed, because that's why I said what's wrong with the Mennonites in Mexico. It seems that they hardly identify with Mexico or with the Spanish language. This is a postcard I bought in Ciudad Cuauhtémoc, and I'm pretty sure that it was produced by Mexicans. Now, it's very interesting. There are 4 little pictures which are connected to Mennonites. So it seems that the Mexicans of the region identify much more with the Mennonites. So you have an apple. Cultivation of apples was introduced by Mennonites. You have a Mennonite house, you have 2 children, and you have cheese. Yeah? And that's very interesting. The Mexicans identify this type of cheese with the Mennonitas. So they call it queso Mennonita. And the Mennonites don't like that at all. They always say, we don't call your cheese queso católico. Yeah? But that is very, very interesting. I'm not sure whether the identification with the Mennonites is so strong. That is a statue which was introduced in Ciudad Cuauhtémoc. It is as ridiculous as it looks like. This is a Mennonite family. And when the Mexicans want to curse the Mennonites, they have 2 possibilities. They can say, pinche minones, or they say, Tarahumara blancas. The Tarahumara are an indigenous group living close to Ciudad Cuauhtémoc in the biggest canyon of the world. It's not the Grand Canyon, it's the Copper Canyon in Chihuahua. And this is one way to describe them if Mexicans want to say something bad. The other way around, it also works. The Mennonites very frequently call the Mexicans Maxa. That's sort of the same thing. So Seminole, Gaines County, a very modest county, first oil producer, first cotton producer, first peanut producer, and they produce delicious peanuts. First people anywhere. The town hall is much more modest. So this is the place where they went. So 3 countries, 3 identities. Max Weber, and this is obviously a republication, at the beginning of the 20th century, he said about Baptist, and he groups the Mennonites with the Baptist groups. Instead, members of the first Baptist communities should practice a strict avoidance of the world. Only absolutely necessary interactions with non-members were permitted. Indeed, as long as the old spirit of these sects remained alive, this principle of avoidance of the world never fully disappeared. Now, if Mennonites lived 100% this way, the title of my talk should be 3 countries, 1 identity. Yeah, but it's 3 countries, 3 identities. First of all, loan words. Yeah? Okay, one could say, well, if they want to speak with Mexicans, they have to speak Spanish. If they want to speak with Americans, they have to speak English. Yeah? If they want to speak with Russians, they have to speak Russian. So that's the source of these loan words. But then the most typical Mennonite dish is varenike. In Poland, you would call that pierogi. So it's a Slavic dish. And no contact with the world, or only absolutely necessary interactions with non-members, doesn't explain the fact that many Mennonites are called Savatsky. That doesn't sound very Frisian to me. It rather sounds Slavic or Polish. Yeah? The very fact that they adopted West Prussian language shows that there was a lot of interaction. Yeah? And we must not forget the other side of the contact. Tavares, in a master's thesis in 1965, I translated it into English, or Deep L translated it into English, writes, although on the one hand, they are excellent colonists and do great economic good for the areas in which they have settled, on the other hand, their social behavior is not desirable because they do not fulfill the basic condition of colonization by foreigners, the willingness to assimilate. Yeah? So we must not forget that in a way, they lead a very egoistical life, yeah? In a way. Okay, why does assimilation seem to happen in the United States, but not in Mexico? What's wrong with the Mennonites? Ask ourselves. Okay, There's one more thing we must not forget. I have talked about external conflicts and internal conflicts, but not all internal conflicts lead to the migration of one of the groups. So here, I'm not going to talk a lot about Canada, but here Canada becomes very important. Yeah. Mostly these problems are different religious convictions. Yeah. And we have the Kleingemeinde, which originated in Molochna, and here in North America, it's called Evangelical Mennonite Church. And some of them migrated in 1948 from Canada to Mexico. That is later than most of the Mennonites. And they started to convert some of the very conservative Mennonites, the Altkolonia and the Rhinelander. And then we have the General Conference Mennonite Church, which is even more progressive than the Kleingemeinde. And they also went to Mexico to convert people. Yeah? So we could also ask ourselves, one country, 3 identities, yeah? Because they all live in the region of Ciudad Cuauhtémoc. Yeah? So there is a scale from conservative to progressive. Okay, attitudes and language behavior and their relationship to self-identification. And this is also a completely new, Mark. You will learn something. So I did a cluster analysis. A cluster analysis, for those among you who do not know anything about statistics, is that I asked the statistics program to cluster groups of people who react identical to certain variables, yeah, who show a similar behavior. Yeah. So the things I asked the program to use for clustering was the attitude towards the majority group, that is Mexicans in Mexico, US Americans in the United States. Very interestingly, here you see that the absolute value, the average of the informants, is not very different. That seems to be a contrast, but you must not forget 2 things. Here, I'm asking only either Mexicans or the United States. The moment I make a contrast, the United States normally wins in their attitudes. Yeah? And again, don't forget, the US American Mennonites have only lived 25 years in the States at that point, and more than 70 years in Mexico. Yeah? So the fact that the value is identical doesn't mean much. The attitudes towards the majority language, Spanish in Mexico, English in the United States, also similar value. But now, language competence in the majority language. This is a scale from 0 to 14 points. Mexico, after 70 years, 6.2. The United States, after 25 years, 10.1. A difference of 4 points in a scale of 14 points is dramatic. Even more dramatic is the oral language use of the majority language. And the questions I sort of summed up here were questions for within the family. How do you talk to your father? How do you talk to the grandfather? How do you talk to your children? If they speak to Mexicans, they have to speak Spanish. But that was not part of it. It's a scale which goes from 0 to 30, 3.5 in Mexico, 9 in the United States. That is really dramatic. So in Mexico, I asked the program to give me 4 clusters. The clusters have between 10 and 24 members, and they behave more or less similarly. So that these variables are going to differ dramatically here, that's the idea of the cluster analysis. But the important thing is, where do we have high numbers and where do we have low numbers? So green are in every line the highest number. So cluster 3 seems to be very fond of Mexicans and Spanish. Cluster 4, anything else? Far from any fondness. Very low. It's not even half of the value here. And here, no comparison whatsoever. This cluster is very interesting because it has a pretty high level here, the attitude towards Mexicans, but this is the lowest, the attitude towards Spanish. So that these values differ so dramatically, that is to be expected. Now see other factors. which are not connected to the cluster analysis, like age. And we see, interestingly, no difference here. Almost the same average age. They are a little bit older, they are a little bit younger, but the difference is not dramatic. Yeah. Gender, the share of women, 20% here. These are the ones who are fond of Mexico and Spanish. 66.7 here. That's a very dramatic change. Church. I allotted 1 point for a progressive informant and 3 points for a conservative informant. And now you see, wow, huge difference. It's a scale of 2 points. Yeah. So these are conservative people. These are very progressive people. The most progressive people are these ones. That is really interesting. Unfortunately, they wouldn't give me more time to go into more detail, so I cannot talk about them. Let's talk about cluster 3 and 4. And let's ask ourselves, so women and conservatives seem to be reluctant to deal with Mexicans and Spanish. We have to be very careful with the women. I attended 3 or 4 services in the conservative churches, and in 2 of them, and I don't think they did it for me, the preacher explicitly said it's a sin for women to talk Spanish. Yeah? So maybe some women would like to learn Spanish, but they cannot, because they belong to a conservative church. Now, one of my questions was, if someone asked you who you are, what would you answer? And one quite frequent answer was, Ich bin Deutscher, I'm German. Obviously, that does not mean I'm German, like when I say I'm German. Look at that. These conservative Mennonites use that in 45% of the informants, whereas the 2 progressive groups use teacher very infrequently. That is rather interesting. Very frequently, they say, I'm a Mennonite. And also here, look at that. So these 2 categories, teacher and Mennonites, make up 80% of this group, 20% of this group, and 30% of this group. And these are the 2 progressive groups. And yeah, the majority, not the majority, but the highest number of self-identification were, I'm a Mexican. Sometimes it was like, they would say, I have a Mexican passport, I'm a Mexican. What am I to say? But interestingly, this group, and that shows that this cluster analysis is not stupid, 70% of them said, I'm Mexican. Whereas here, you have just 10%. Yeah? So the way they identify is really very important, and important just to show you that it doesn't mean that they want to say, if they say Ich bin Deutscher, that they want to say that they are German in a way as I am a German. Yeah? For example, here, this 32-year-old woman says, we are related to, what does Germany mean for you? We are related to them. They are white people, our ancestors, which is not true because they were Frisian and Flanders. But she says, I'm a Mexican. Yeah? So, was bedeutet Deutschland für sie? It's something special because it's German. Yeah? And she says, I'm German. So maybe for her, German means something different than for this person, which I don't like, who said, it's just a country. But I'm a German. Ich bin Deutscher. So let's go to the United States. Same thing, cluster analysis. These are the numbers. 4 clusters between 7 and 29 members. And we can see, okay, here are sort of the progressive clusters with higher averages, and this is the most conservative cluster, and this is a rather conservative cluster. So this is the language behavior, competence, and language use. Yeah? And these values are very high. These values are pretty low for in comparison within the United States. Let's see, age. Look at that. The range in Mexico was between 32 and 45 years. The range here is between 19 and 41, much higher. Age rules. And that is a situation of change. In Mexico, it doesn't seem to be a situation of change. Here, something happened that made people change. Women in Mexico, the difference is between 20 and 66%. Here, it's between 45 and 71. Although this share is the highest, the spread is much smaller. Yeah. Church in Mexico, that was 1.2 to 2.5. Here it's between 1.7 and 2.4. Very equal. Yeah. So it's clear that in the United States, we can say with respect to US Americans and English, age seems to rule. Just one thing which I think interesting is this group here. They have very high values for the language behavior and rather low values for the attitudes. And interestingly, most of them are women. Yeah? So it seems that something forces them to learn English and to converse in English, although they don't like Americans and they don't really, or they don't have positive attitudes towards Americans and towards English. So how about age is the important point. How do they auto identify themselves? So teacher, 23. That makes sense. But no, in a way it doesn't make sense because they have very high values with regard to the United States and a very high value of saying they are a teacher. And these people, lowest value, although they don't, the identification with Americans is much less strong. In Mexico, that was between 10 and 45, higher spread. Mennonite, many. In Mexico, the spread is between 0 and 37%. Here, it's between 30 and 71. So many more informants in the United States use Mennonite as their identification, as their first identification. So it seems that for them, I don't know why, the religious identification is more important than the probably language-based identification. Only 3 say, I'm an American. That's now striking. We would have probably thought that many more do that, but don't forget, they have only lived 25 years in the States at that point. Yeah? So that makes sense. In Mexico, it's much higher, the people who self-identify as Mexicans. Same thing. What means Germany for you? Nothing special. Yeah? What are you? Who are you? Germany. Yeah? What a lovely person. A dreamland, Germany. And obviously she's going to say Deutscher. Hitler comes to mind. Don't mention the war. Yeah? And then it makes sense that this person prefers to self-identify as Mennonite. Okay. How much time do I have still? 10 minutes? Good. Is that 10 minutes before the 5 extra minutes? Okay. Okay. There are other identifications, for example, mixed ones like German Mennonite, Mexican Mennonite, or German Mennonite from Canada. I just want to highlight 3 things. Christian. 3 informants in the United States said, I'm a Christian. Not a single informant in Mexico did so. That fits very well to the fact that in the United States, more people made a point of self-identify as Mennonite. That fits nicely. We must not forget, although they didn't use maleta in this one sentence, and they did not use, I think I have, among thousands of loanwords, I have 2 Spanish loanwords in the United States. Some in the United States say, I'm a German Mexican, I'm a Mennonite from Mexico. Now that is very interesting. Having lived 25 years in the States and still saying, I'm a Mennonite from Mexico, o simplemente soy mexicano. Yeah? And also very interesting, some of them still identify with Canada. Now, do not forget, many Mennonites in Mexico still have Canadian passports. Yeah? But it's interesting that only one Mennonite in the US used Canada, whereas 4 in Mexico. And remember, they go to Mexico for 1 year, they go to Canada for 1 year, and they come back speaking English fluently. So that is really very interesting, and there's a lot more to be said about that. My conclusions, to keep in time. With regard to Mexicans, Mennonite Low German is maintained in Mexico primarily because the majority society does not seem to be attractive enough to many Mennonites, especially to women and members of conservative churches. In addition, the Mennonites are an important group in Chihuahua and are on average richer than Mexicans in the region. Yeah, that is a very important thing, which led to a program because remember the quote by Tavares that says, well, you live in this country, you should sort of assimilate a little bit. And the Mexican government started like 20 years ago to impose newer rules. But they are not stupid. They know what Mennonites like to do in this case. They just migrate to Bolivia. Yeah? So they created a program, Chihuahua vive con los Mennonitas. It does not exist anymore, but you can find it in the internet still. So they tried to create a stronger bond between the Mennonites and Mexico. Importantly, and obviously, nothing is wrong with Mexico, much less with Mexicans. It's just the Mexican culture and its dominant religion are just too different to attract more Mennonites. But you saw that once the Mennonites develop positive attitudes towards Mexicans, towards Spanish, and start using Spanish, the interesting question is what happens first? Then they identify as Mexicans. Yeah? Importantly and obviously, nothing is wrong with the Mennonites in Mexico either. Those who develop positive attitudes towards, yeah, I said that. Conclusions with regard to the United States. Mennonite Low German in the United States is quickly disappearing. If I had 10 more minutes, I would have shown you that is really dramatic after such a short time and very different from Pennsylvania German. Yeah? Because the majority society, and especially its language, is so attractive, or seems to be so attractive, that the Mennonites have learned English very quickly. And I would have liked to show you some videos where you see 70-year-old Mennonite women in Seminole during the Corona crisis, and they are knitting masks. Yeah, and the 70-year-old woman speaks English with a strong accent, but speaks English quite well. And her daughter and her granddaughter, I'm pretty sure that you wouldn't notice that they are non-native speakers. Perhaps you would note a Texan accent, but you wouldn't notice that they are non-native speakers. Yeah? And this is really something very interesting. It's very hard to find women in Mexico who speak Spanish. It's much easier to find Mennonite women in Mexico who speak brilliantly English. Yeah? It's really amazing. And in a way, it's fascinating. And well, as I still have 5 minutes, I can add an anecdote. I did an interview with the help of a Mennonite woman in Mexico, with a conservative woman. She was like 65 years old. I don't speak Low German, so a teacher of a progressive school helped me. So I understood the answers, but I couldn't ask the questions. And then I had the question, would you like to know English better? Would you like to know Spanish better? And this 65-year-old woman started to cry, really sobbing. And she said, it's so horrible. I have been born in this country. I have never left this country, and I'm not able to speak to the Mexicans. Yeah? So that is what I meant, that if we have such a low share of women who have positive attitudes, it's much more probable that they cannot express their attitudes. Yeah? I remember one interview I did with a 20-year-old lady, and I was much younger, so I was not allowed to stay alone with her in her room, and she was conservative. Her husband was by her side. I asked her the question, her husband would answer. And then I said, shut up. No, I didn't say that, but I said that I'm interested in her answers. But I mean, I knew that I couldn't use this interview because she was always looking at him. Am I allowed to say that? A Mexican with whom I conversed about the Mennonites told me, "Los Mennonitas son muy machos." And if a Mennonite, Northern Mexican man says they are very macho, that means something. So why does that happen so quickly? Protestantism in the United States is not as different from the Mennonite faith as is Catholicism in Mexico. Yeah? And Holy Land is not all over the United States. English is linguistically much closer to Mennonite Low German than to Spanish. Other important factors are that the Mennonites are not economically dominant in Texas, and that the US-American society puts a lot of pressure on immigrants. Yeah? Importantly, and obviously, nothing is wrong with the Mennonites in the United States. They do not yet identify as US Americans because at the time of data collection, they had only lived in Texas for 25 years. So this is 30 years ago. I'm sure that has changed dramatically. Thank you very much. And this photo was taken by Jakob Sawatzki.